You think your grandparents only survived on beans and bread? Think again. During the hardest times in American history, families transformed pennies into meals that fed entire households with creativity and love. Let's dig into 60 cheap dinners our grandparents ate to survive. Hardtack and hot water soup, often eaten by soldiers and during times of extreme hardship, was about making do with what you had, even if it wasn't much. Hardtack, the hard, dry biscuit that could survive for months, would be soaked in boiling water, softening into a mushy, soggy mess. This was what survival often looked like, taking something that had no taste or texture and turning it into something you could at least swallow. Hardtack and hot water soup was a reminder that when times were tough, you didn't have the luxury of taste. You ate because you had to, and any sustenance, no matter how bland or unappealing, was better than nothing at all. For those who survived on it, it remains a symbol of the grit and determination required to get by when the world seemed to be offering nothing but hardship. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the proud invention of leftovers and late nights. You'd open the fridge, see a bowl of yesterday's spaghetti, and realize that bread was the only thing left. So you'd scoop the cold noodles right onto the bread, fold it over, and take a bite. It was messy, chewy, and surprisingly satisfying. The sauce soaked into the bread, turning it into something that didn't need reheating or plating. It became a classic among factory workers, college kids, and tired parents who didn't have the energy to reheat a pan. It might have looked ridiculous, but it worked. It was dinner without dishes. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were proof that comfort food doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you full. Sloppy Joes on toasted buns were the messy, lovable dinners that 1960s kids acted like they could not live without. The name itself promised a meal where neatness did not matter. Mothers loved that 1 pound of meat could stretch far when mixed with sauce and seasonings. The skillet popped as the beef cooked, and when the sauce hit the pan, the whole house filled with that warm, tangy smell everyone recognized. The buns were lightly toasted to keep them from falling apart. Not that it ever worked. The sandwich dripped, slipped, and made a mess, and that was the entire point. Every bite was comforting and familiar, the kind of food that made a plain evening feel like something to look forward to. Mothers liked how fast and cheap it was, and kids begged for it because it felt like dinner made just for them. Sloppy Joes were childhood joy disguised as dinner. Macaroni and tomatoes were a Depression-era classic, simple, humble, and oddly satisfying. This was not pasta. It was just boiled elbow noodles drowning in stewed tomatoes, maybe with a spoonful of butter if you had it. Some families added sugar to cut the acidity, others added salt and pepper and called it gourmet. Either way, it was a bowl of starch and acidity that somehow passed for dinner. You would eat it with a fork because spoons were for people who made soup. Macaroni and tomatoes made no apologies. It was what you threw together when the pantry had almost nothing but cans and carbs. It filled your stomach and quieted the kind of hunger that made your ribs ache. And sometimes, just sometimes, it tasted like home. The sauce stained your bowl orange and clung to the bottom like it wanted to stay. If you ever asked what was for dinner and got this, you knew things were tight. And you also knew not to complain, because no one had time for complaints. You just ate, chewed slow, and wondered how something so bland could feel so familiar. That is what makes it special. It was not delicious, it was dependable. Eggplant Parmesan casserole gave budget-minded families a taste of Italian-inspired comfort without the cost of imported ingredients. Slices of eggplant were lightly breaded, quickly browned in a skillet, and layered with canned tomato sauce, dried oregano, and a modest sprinkle of grated cheese. Baked until the sauce bubbled and the cheese melted, the dish emerged fragrant and hearty, ready to feed a hungry household. Because eggplant was plentiful in late summer and canned tomatoes were available year-round, the recipe fit perfectly into a thrifty meal plan. Many 1960s home cooks discovered it through community cookbooks that encouraged vegetable-centered dinners when meat prices rose. Served with a side of spaghetti or crusty bread, it felt festive enough for company while staying within a modest budget. The mild flavor of the eggplant absorbed the savory sauce beautifully, making each bite satisfying without the need for heavy amounts of cheese or meat. Eggplant Parmesan casserole quickly became a reliable favorite for families eager to stretch their food dollars while still offering something warm and flavorful. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Evaporated milk and cracker soup was the result of the desperate need to stretch ingredients as far as possible. A can of evaporated milk, which was more shelf-stable than regular milk, was mixed with water to make a thin broth. Broken crackers, often the stale remnants of a loaf, were then added to thicken the soup. It wasn't a luxurious meal by any stretch, but it was filling, and it was comforting in a way only simple foods could be. In a time when fresh ingredients were hard to come by, evaporated milk and cracker soup became a quick fix for hunger. The sweetness of the evaporated milk, combined with the saltiness of the crackers, created a strange balance that worked. You could serve it hot or cold, depending on what you had available. While it may not have been the most satisfying dish, it provided a moment of relief for those who needed it. In a world where food often felt scarce, evaporated milk and cracker soup was a reminder that survival often required making do with what you had, no matter how strange the combination. Cornmeal was the magic dust of poor households, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly useful. A single sack could turn into mush for breakfast, hoe cakes for lunch, and cornbread for dinner. Farmers used it, miners used it, families swore by it. Cornmeal was filling, nutritious, and worked with just about any leftover you had lying around. It was the one ingredient that could carry you through a whole week of hunger without complaint. People used it with lard drippings to make golden cakes crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. For others, it meant a pot of warm corn mush, sweetened with molasses or salted for a savory twist. Kids grew up on it, and mothers stretched it with water when milk was gone. When the pantry looked bare, cornmeal never disappointed. It was the friend that always stayed. Its grainy texture and rich smell of roasting corn were the scent of home for millions. Even today, there's something grounding about a skillet of cornbread, reminding us how far thrift and a bit of grit could take a person. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. Jiffy corn muffins with jelly were warm, golden treats that made ordinary mornings feel like something sweeter. Mothers loved how quick the mix was, needing only a splash of milk or water before going into the oven. As they baked, the house filled with a sweet, buttery smell that made kids hover until the timer rang. Split open while still steaming, each muffin melted the grape jelly spread across its soft center. Every bite was sweet, warm, and comforting, the kind of food that felt like a hug. Kids loved their small size and always reached for more than one. Mothers appreciated how affordable they were and how long a batch lasted. Kids begged for them because they tasted like childhood in its simplest, happiest form. They were a small luxury in a decade full of stretched budgets. Cornbread and milk was a Southern lullaby disguised as dinner. You took day-old cornbread, dry, crumbly, almost stale, and dropped it into a glass of cold milk. No sugar, no spice, just spoon and memory. It was humble food, the kind you did not question because your grandparents ate it too. Some people used buttermilk, others regular. It depended on what was left in the fridge and how soft you needed the bread to be. You ate it with a spoon, slowly, like it was soup. It filled you without asking for attention. It was cheap, simple, and oddly soothing. There was something honest about it, like admitting you had little but making peace with it anyway. In some homes, this was a treat. In others, a last resort. Either way, it kept bellies full and silence at the table. That matters more than most people know. Zucchini tomato layer. Bake turned overflowing summer gardens into a warm and colorful family meal that fit any budget. Thin slices of zucchini were alternated with canned tomatoes inside a buttered casserole dish, sprinkled lightly with breadcrumbs and a handful of grated cheese. As it baked, the vegetables released their juices, blending with the cheese to create a savory sauce that required no extra effort. This dish became a staple during peak harvest months, when zucchini was plentiful and nearly free from backyard gardens or neighborhood swaps. Home cooks appreciated how easily it adapted to what they had on hand, allowing the addition of fresh herbs or a scattering of leftover rice to make it more filling. Served hot with crusty bread, it offered a complete vegetarian supper that satisfied even the most dedicated meat eaters. The simple preparation, bright flavors, and low cost made it a dependable recipe that graced countless 1960s dinner tables, celebrating the abundance of late summer produce while keeping grocery bills comfortably low for hard-working families. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Salt pork and boiled water soup began with one single cube of meat, small, hard, and saltier than anything else in the house. That lone piece of salt pork got dropped into a pot of water, where it slowly surrendered its fat and flavor over the course of an hour. You watched the sheen rise to the surface, a slick halo of grease that promised at least a little richness. The smell was better than the taste, and everyone knew it. But no one complained. Sometimes a potato was diced into the broth, sometimes an onion, but often it was just water and pork, enough to convince the tongue that you were eating soup instead of flavored water. The meat itself was never served. That cube stayed in the pot, reused again tomorrow, until it finally disintegrated from overuse. That was the rule. You fed the family with its echo, not its flesh. It was not satisfying. It was not filling. But it was hot. It was something. And in a time when you had nothing to spare, the scent of simmering pork fat was a strange kind of comfort. It meant someone was still trying. Powdered cheese rice came straight from the era of boxed dinners and instant fixes. When the macaroni ran out but that bright orange packet of cheese dust was still sitting in the box, you made do. You'd toss it into a pot of leftover rice with a splash of milk or margarine, stir until everything turned creamy, and serve it like it was gourmet. It was the taste of the 1980s on a budget. Salty, neon orange, and undeniably satisfying. Parents knew it would fill stomachs fast, and kids didn't know they were eating leftovers dressed up as something special. You could stretch one box of mac and cheese into 3 nights of dinners if you were smart about it. That glowing cheese powder had a power of its own. It made anything feel a little indulgent, even plain rice. Powdered cheese rice was comfort disguised as convenience, a hack born from necessity and nostalgia. Spaghetti with butter and Parmesan shake was one of the easiest, cheapest, and most beloved meals a mother could make in the 1960s, which is exactly why kids asked for it constantly. It started with a pot of pasta boiling on the stove, the steam fogging up the kitchen windows as the noodles softened. Kids loved watching the long strands swirl in the water like they were dancing just for them. Once drained, the pasta went back into the pot where a generous pat of butter melted instantly, coating every strand in a glossy shine. Then came the Parmesan shake, that little green can that lived in almost every pantry kids loved, doing the shaking themselves, even though mothers had to take over to prevent the entire can from dumping into the pot. The flavor was simple but perfect. Buttery, salty, warm, and comforting in a way that made you want to curl up right beside the pot with a fork. Mothers appreciated it because it cost almost nothing and took barely any time. But kids appreciated it because it felt like the kind of meal that understood them. It was soft, easy to eat, and satisfying in a way nothing else quite managed. It tasted like after-school hunger being solved in minutes. It tasted like staying up a little later than normal. It tasted like childhood in a bowl. Kids begged for this dish because it never disappointed, never felt boring, and always made everything better, even on the days that felt long and gray. Spaghetti with butter and Parmesan shake was proof that comfort did not require complicated recipes. It only required heart. Potato soup was the warmth you clung to when the cold came early and the paycheck came late. You peeled potatoes with dull knives, boiled them in water, and added onions if you had them. The broth was made from milk, or sometimes just more water and hope. It was not fancy. It was not thick. But it was hot and filling and honest. Some families added cheese or bacon bits if they had a little extra. Most just salted it until it tasted like something. You ate it slowly, holding the bowl in your hands like it might warm more than just your fingers. Leftovers were poured into jars and reheated for the next night. It was the kind of soup that stretched itself to meet your needs. It never judged you for having nothing else, and in that way, it did more than feed you. It forgave you. Vegetable curry stew introduced a mild touch of international flavor to American kitchens while staying firmly in the realm of affordable comfort food. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and canned chickpeas simmered slowly with a gentle dusting of curry powder, filling the house with a warm, spiced aroma that felt both new and familiar. The recipe was flexible enough to accept any vegetables on hand, making it ideal for gardeners or thrifty shoppers. During the 1960s, when interest in global flavors was growing, this stew offered a budget-friendly way to explore something different without leaving the home kitchen. Served with plain rice or a slice of crusty bread, it delivered a complete protein and plenty of satisfying texture. Families discovered that the spices brightened otherwise simple ingredients, proving that excitement at the dinner table did not require expensive meats or specialty imports. Vegetable curry stew stands as a delicious example of how mid-century cooks embraced fresh ideas while still practicing the frugality and adaptability that defined their daily meals. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Liver and rice boil was another resourceful creation for those who lived through the leanest times. Organ meats, often discarded by those with the luxury of choice, became the lifeblood of many struggling families. Liver, kidneys, and heart, pieces many would turn up their noses at, were boiled with rice and whatever spices could be found to add flavor. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. Rice, the staple that could stretch a meal, absorbed the broth from the simmering organs, creating a hearty, if not entirely pleasant, dish. There wasn't much choice in the matter. The bitter irony of the dish wasn't lost on anyone who had to eat it. What many considered awful was transformed into a lifeline. Today, we might turn up our noses at liver and rice, but back then, it was a reminder of just how resourceful and desperate life could become when the pantry was bare. Stewed okra and tomatoes from summer jars brought sunshine into the deepest part of winter, reminding families of months when gardens overflowed. When cold weather settled in and fresh vegetables vanished from stores or became too expensive, those jars sitting in the pantry felt like pure gold. Grandma opened them with a soft pop, poured everything into a pot, and let it simmer with onions, spices, and sometimes a little bacon grease. The okra softened into tender pieces that thickened the stew naturally, while the tomatoes added brightness that cut through winter gloom. This dish tasted like stored-up hope, sunlight sealed tight and saved for the months when the world outside felt gray and unforgiving. It was not fancy, but it was precious, a reminder that careful planning and steady hands could carry a family through any season. Stewed okra and tomatoes tasted like resilience captured in a jar. Celery leaf broth was another example of how people made use of what would typically be thrown away. The tops of celery stalks, often discarded as waste, became the foundation for a surprisingly flavorful broth. In a time when every scrap of food was precious, even the smallest bits were salvaged. The celery leaves, full of a delicate, almost grassy flavor, were simmered with water, creating a light broth that was both soothing and filling. It wasn't much, but in the world of rationing, it was enough. A little salt, maybe some pepper, and it became a comforting soup for those who needed it most. The idea of turning something most people didn't even consider into a meal was a reflection of the mindset that prevailed during these difficult times. Everything had value. Every scrap could contribute to survival. For those who lived through it, celery leaf broth wasn't just food. It was a reminder that the key to survival was resourcefulness, the ability to find value in what others had discarded. Salt pork and lard were the beating heart of every poor man's pantry. When you think of survival food, you probably imagine beans or bread, but it was actually fat that kept most families alive through harsh winters. Salt pork was the flavor base, the miracle worker, and the cheapest source of calories anyone could get their hands on. It was heavily salted so it would not spoil and could last for months in a cool pantry, making it a godsend when refrigeration was a luxury. People would slice it thin and use just a little piece to fry potatoes, season beans, or grease a skillet before making cornbread. Every drop of lard saved from Sunday dinners went into a tin bucket because nothing was wasted. You could bake with it, fry with it, even spread it on toast if times were really desperate. The smell of lard sizzling on an iron pan became a kind of comfort, the sound of someone trying their best. Kids would joke about fat bread breakfasts, but they ate it happily. There was a quiet pride in making something out of scraps, in keeping bellies full without going hungry. Those buckets of lard were as valuable as gold to a household, standing for patience, frugality, and the sort of cleverness that came from doing more with less. You might not see lard buckets in a modern kitchen anymore, but back then, they meant survival, pure and simple. Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake was the definition of 1980s ingenuity, a dinner built from scraps that somehow felt like a feast. You'd mix canned tuna with a spoonful of mayonnaise, maybe stretch it with a little celery or onion if you had it, and spread it into a battered casserole dish. Then came the magic. A blanket of crushed Ritz crackers sprinkled over the top, glistening with butter, and a few slices of processed cheese layered for good measure. When it baked, the edges browned, the middle bubbled, and the smell filled the whole apartment like hope. It looked like luxury, but it was born from frugality. You could feed a whole family on 1 can of tuna and half a box of crackers and still have leftovers for the next day. Kids fought over the crispy top layer while parents smiled in relief. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, comforting, and rich in all the right ways. This dish didn't just fill plates, it filled the silence that hunger left behind. Ritz Cracker Tuna Melt Bake turned a handful of cheap ingredients into something that tasted like victory after another long, hard day. Baked ham slices with pineapple rings were the simple, budget-conscious way mothers brought a little holiday spirit to an ordinary night. Instead of buying a whole ham, which was far too expensive for many families, they used thin slices that cooked quickly and filled the kitchen with a rich, salty smell. The pineapple rings made everything feel festive, their syrupy sweetness soaking into the ham as it baked. Kids loved how bright and cheerful the dish looked, the glossy fruit sitting right on top like something out of a magazine. Mothers loved how easy it was, just a few ingredients layered on a pan and placed into the oven. When it came out bubbling and golden at the edges, it felt like a celebration even when nothing special was happening. For kids, it tasted like the fancy meals they imagined other families ate, even though theirs was made with thrift and creativity. It was proof that you could turn something inexpensive into something joyful with almost no effort. Rice and gravy was the meal that whispered, "We made it work," after a long, hungry day. Plain white rice, nothing more than starch and steam, was cooked in big pots that never emptied as fast as you thought. And the gravy? That was magic. You scraped the bottom of the meat pan, mixed the fat and flour, maybe some milk if you were lucky, and stirred until it thickened. There was no meat, not really, just the memory of it. But the gravy carried the flavor like a story passed down from better times. You poured it over the rice and watched it disappear into the grains, turning white into brown, bland into bold. It was hot, heavy, and exactly what you needed. Sometimes there was no salt, sometimes no butter, but always the same bowl, the same spoon, the same quiet hope that tomorrow's meal would be more. Rice and gravy was not flashy, it was not celebrated, but it showed up and it stayed. Pea and egg salad plate was a thrifty supper that turned humble staples into a refreshing main dish for a warm evening. Canned peas were drained and chilled before being folded with chopped hard-boiled eggs, diced celery, and a splash of mild vinegar dressing. A pinch of dry mustard or a spoon of mayonnaise added just enough richness to bind everything together while still keeping the cost low. Served on crisp lettuce leaves or alongside sliced tomatoes from the backyard garden, it provided protein and texture without any need for meat. Home cooks loved how quickly it came together using pantry items that were inexpensive and easy to find year-round. Children enjoyed the gentle sweetness of the peas, while adults appreciated the subtle tang from the dressing. This simple combination was light enough for summertime, but filling enough to carry a family through a busy evening, reflecting the practical yet creative spirit of mid-century kitchens, where canned vegetables and eggs formed the backbone of many dependable weeknight meals. Canned tomato and elbow macaroni soup was not glamorous, but it made the pantry stretch. 1 can of tomatoes, sometimes whole, sometimes crushed, got poured into a pot with water and a few handfuls of elbow macaroni. You let the pasta swell until it filled the pot with soft, starchy bulk. If you had a bouillon cube, in it went. If you had milk, you added a splash to cut the acidity. The whole thing tasted like warmth and metal, especially when cooked in an old aluminum pan. You could dress it up with a sprinkle of sugar or a pat of butter, but most of the time it was just tomato and noodle, red and white, bland and better than nothing. Kids would pick through it, looking for a miracle. Adults just spooned it in, chewing with their jaws and not their hearts. It was fast. It was filling. It was honest. And in a world full of dinner tables that asked for patience and sacrifice, this soup asked for very little. It expected you to show up hungry, and it met you where you were. No judgment, no surprise, just enough. Macaroni with butter and cheese powder was one of the most requested comfort meals of the entire decade. A dish that took almost no time to make but somehow lived rent-free in the memories of every child who grew up in the 1960s. It started with a simple pot of boiling water and a box that promised creamy, cheesy goodness without costing very much at all. Those little elbow noodles dropped into the water like tiny soldiers, rising and sinking while kids watched the steam swirl around the kitchen. When the noodles softened and the water got drained, that was when the magic began. A little butter, a little milk, and that iconic packet of cheese powder turned everything bright orange in a way that felt exciting, almost like you were watching color appear right out of thin air. Kids loved stirring it, even if their mothers always had to fix it afterward because kids never quite got the cheese mixed in all the way. But the taste was what mattered. It was salty, creamy, warm, and cozy, like taking a bite out of happiness itself. It stuck to the spoon in a way that promised you would not be hungry again anytime soon. Mothers served it on busy nights, lazy afternoons, weekends, and days when the weather looked gloomy and everyone needed something cheerful. It was cheap, filling, and dependable, the kind of meal that felt like a little celebration even when there was no reason to celebrate. Kids begged for it constantly, probably more than any other meal because it tasted like childhood in its simplest form. No pretension, no fuss, just pure comfort that came from a box and made the whole day feel better. Cabbage soup was the dinner of last resort, but it never let you down. You took a head of cabbage, chopped it rough, and threw it into boiling water or broth. Add onions, add carrots, add whatever vegetables you could scrounge from the crisper. The broth was thin, sometimes flavored with a bouillon cube, sometimes just salt and pepper. But it filled the house with steam and the smell of something cooking, something real. You served it in big bowls, sometimes with bread, sometimes without. It was watery, it was plain, but it was warm, and it kept your belly full. Some families made it with a little ground meat or sausage if they had it. Most just leaned on the cabbage and hoped it stretched far enough. It was not the kind of soup you bragged about, but it was the kind you remembered, because it showed up when there was almost nothing left. Of cuts without the price, an idea perfectly suited to the frugal 1960s kitchen. Ground pork was blended with breadcrumbs, minced onion, and a touch of milk before being seasoned with a bit of sage and pepper to mimic the gentle taste of veal. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and baked until the top formed a golden crust and the inside stayed moist and tender. A light tomato glaze or brown gravy completed the illusion, giving families a hearty centerpiece that felt far fancier than its ingredients suggested. This recipe became a favorite in community cookbooks and church fundraisers because it fed a crowd with ingredients already on hand. Leftovers made excellent sandwiches the next day, stretching the value even further. By transforming simple pork and pantry staples into something that seemed luxurious, mock veal loaf embodied the clever resourcefulness that defined many mid-century American dinners, proving that satisfying flavor did not require an expensive shopping list or complicated preparation. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Salted fish winter hash was the frugal, filling meal families leaned on when fresh meat was too expensive or hard to find. Preserved fish lasted through the season, and Grandma knew exactly how to stretch it. She flaked the fish into a skillet with potatoes and onions, frying everything until the edges turned crisp and golden. The saltiness of the fish balanced the softness of the potatoes, creating a dish that was simple but satisfying. This hash filled the house with an aroma that felt strong and familiar, reminding families of old traditions and careful planning. Salted fish winter hash tasted like resilience, thrift, and the determination to create something good out of whatever the season offered. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. Cold spaghetti omelet transformed yesterday's dinner into a surprising lunch treat that delighted thrifty church cooks. Leftover spaghetti, often sauced lightly with tomato, was folded into beaten eggs, seasoned with black pepper and a touch of grated cheese, then poured into a hot skillet. As it cooked, the pasta strands settled into a golden crust while the eggs puffed gently around them. The omelet was flipped once to achieve a crisp exterior and a tender interior that sliced easily into wedges. Served at room temperature, it traveled well and stayed tasty even after hours on the picnic table. This dish reflected the inventive spirit of home cooks who refused to waste a single noodle and proved that a satisfying meal could come from simple leftovers. Children enjoyed the playful texture, while adults appreciated the hearty flavor that paired perfectly with fresh greens or sliced tomatoes from the church garden. It stood as a testament to resourcefulness and the belief that no blessing, however small, should ever be thrown away. Television dinners were what happened when the future met the food budget. Frozen meals in foil trays, stacked in the freezer like little time capsules of convenience. Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, peas or corn, a square of apple cobbler that always burned your tongue. You pulled it from the box, popped it in the oven, and waited. No prep, no planning. Just peel back the foil and pretend you were eating like everyone else. These dinners were born in the 1950s, but they stuck around because they made sense. Especially when you worked late or your parents were too tired to cook, or there just was not enough of anything to make a real meal. The food never looked like the picture. But it was hot. It had variety. It felt like a feast when you only expected a sandwich. You ate it in front of the television, a tray on your lap, the glow of the screen making it all feel a little more okay. These dinners were never about flavor. They were about escape. Corn and cottage cheese pie turned two budget staples into a surprisingly elegant dinner dish that impressed guests as well as family. Sweet corn kernels, either fresh or canned, were combined with creamy cottage cheese, beaten eggs, and a touch of flour to create a smooth filling that set beautifully inside a simple pastry shell. Baking brought out a gentle sweetness that paired perfectly with the tang of the cheese, making each slice rich yet light. This pie was easy to prepare ahead of time and served equally well warm or at room temperature, an advantage for busy hosts or church suppers. The ingredients were inexpensive and widely available, making it an accessible option for families looking to stretch their food dollars without sacrificing flavor. Leftovers held up well and could be enjoyed for breakfast or lunch the next day. Its enduring charm lies in how it transforms humble pantry items into something that feels like a special occasion, capturing the inventive spirit of 1960s American home cooking. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Bread heel and onion soup came from the back of the pantry and the bottom of the loaf. Those last hunks of bread, too dry to enjoy but too precious to toss, were torn into cubes and browned in a skillet with sliced onions. If there was any fat left in the house, it got used here. Then came the boiling water, poured right in. It hissed, it steamed, it turned the skillet into a bubbling potion that smelled better than it tasted. But it did taste like effort, like someone cared enough to turn nothing into something. Children wrinkled their noses. Adults stared into it, spooned it up anyway. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a dash of pepper elevated it just enough. You were not supposed to savor it. You were supposed to eat and get on with it. This was food that filled space, not hearts. But it stayed in memory like a splinter, because even if it was plain, it was earned. You watched your parents stir that pan with tired wrists and wondered how long it took to learn how to survive without complaint. And that soup, bland as it was, always tasted like an answer you were not ready to hear. Boiled custard, sipped warm, was one of the richest winter drinks families shared before refrigeration made cold treats common. Made from milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, the mixture thickened slowly on the stove, demanding patience and constant stirring. When Grandma poured it into mugs, steam rose in soft curls that warmed cold hands instantly. The custard was silky, sweet, and comforting in a way that felt almost luxurious. Families shared it on cold evenings, sitting close together while the house creaked under the weight of winter wind. This was more than a drink. It was a moment, a ritual that made everyone feel cared for. Boiled custard tasted like warmth poured straight from the heart. Peanut butter and onion soup was a surprisingly common dish in Southern kitchens, where people learned to make meals out of whatever ingredients they could get their hands on. The combination of peanut butter, which provided protein and fat, with onions, which added depth and flavor, created a surprisingly balanced broth. The peanut butter dissolved into the soup, thickening it and giving it a richness that you wouldn't expect from such humble ingredients. The onions, when softened, offered a sharp contrast to the creamy texture of the peanut butter, creating a unique flavor profile that was both satisfying and filling. It wasn't a dish that many would seek out for its taste, but it became a common solution during hard times when there wasn't much else to work with. It was proof that when there was little to be had, the right combinations could make anything work. Molasses jugs were the sweetness in a bitter life. Cheap and long-lasting, molasses could turn the plainest meal into something special. You could drizzle it on cornbread, stir it into beans, or mix it with hot water for a makeshift tea. It had a deep, smoky sweetness that tasted like comfort itself. Poor families loved it because it was cheaper than sugar and lasted 10 times longer. A single jug could see a household through months of tight times. Kids dipped biscuits in it, farmers used it to sweeten their coffee, and mothers poured it into cakes when they wanted to feel fancy. That thick, dark syrup was more than food. It was memory in liquid form. When money was thin and cupboards nearly bare, molasses was the one indulgence you could still afford. It reminded people that joy could still exist in small, sticky spoons. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one can could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. Canned spaghetti and meatballs was the simple, straight-from-the-can miracle that 1960s kids thought tasted like restaurant food. Mothers bought it because it was cheap, fast, and required nothing but heating. The noodles were soft, the tiny meatballs were tender, and the sweet tomato sauce felt comforting and familiar. Kids always rushed in as soon as the can opener clicked, knowing exactly what smell would fill the kitchen next. It was messy, fun, and easy to eat. The kind of dinner kids slurped instead of politely ate. Mothers relied on it for long days and tight budgets, and kids loved it because it felt like a treat. It tasted like late dinners after playing outside and simple joy without explanation. Canned spaghetti and meatballs were cheap comfort disguised as something special. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food. Not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up over the sink or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. Raisin rice. Pilaf proved that a meatless dinner could still feel special and satisfying when handled with care. White rice was simmered slowly with a bit of butter until each grain was tender, then tossed with plump raisins that had been soaked in warm water to bring out their natural sweetness. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg added gentle spice, turning plain rice into a fragrant dish that filled the kitchen with an inviting aroma. Many 1960s households served this pilaf as a main course on nights when meat was too expensive, or saved it for church suppers where a simple vegetarian option was welcome. It paired beautifully with a crisp green salad or a side of baked apples, creating a balanced meal from inexpensive ingredients. Leftovers reheated well for breakfast with a drizzle of honey or a splash of milk. The dish showed how a few pantry staples could stretch a grocery budget and proved that even the simplest ingredients could deliver comfort and a hint of elegance at the dinner table. Mock veal loaf delivered the flavor of expensive. Carrot marmalade was a sweet spread that helped families feel like they had something luxurious for breakfast, even in the toughest years of the Depression. Sugar was precious, but when it could be managed, grated carrots simmered down with citrus peel made a bright orange jam that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Citrus itself was not always available, so many recipes leaned heavily on the carrots, using peel or extract when possible. The finished marmalade was thick, fragrant, and easily spread across homemade bread or crackers, turning simple staples into something that felt festive. Children loved its sweetness, and parents appreciated how it stretched a handful of carrots into enough jam to last for several mornings. Many community cookbooks published carrot marmalade recipes, encouraging families to rely on what they could grow in gardens. It was a dish that turned scarcity into creativity, and for many households it became a small comfort that brightened otherwise plain and repetitive meals. Cabbage core soup was born in kitchens where waste was not an option and flavor came second to survival. After the outer leaves were used in slaw or boiled down for supper, the hard, pale heart of the cabbage, the part most people threw away, was chopped fine and dropped into boiling water. It had a bite to it, fibrous and bitter, but when cooked long enough with salt and maybe a pinch of sugar, it softened into something close to tender. The broth turned cloudy, greenish, and carried a faint sweetness like memory. If a bone was lying around, even a clean one, it went into the pot for luck. Families poured it over day-old bread or paired it with a spoonful of lard. It was never anyone's favorite, but it was honest. It reminded you of how close the line was between waste and worth. Sometimes the older folks would say this soup kept us through the hard winters. Kids rolled their eyes, but they still ate every drop. That cabbage core, once considered trash, became the backbone of dinner. And in a way, it tasted like persistence, chewy, bitter, and unwilling to give up. Peanut butter bread pudding was the dessert you made when every sweet thing in the house was gone, but no one wanted to end dinner on an empty note. You'd tear up old bread, pour over a mix of milk, sugar, and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter, then bake until the top turned golden and sticky. The smell filled the house like a warm blanket. It was thick, sweet, and rich enough to make you forget how cheap it was. No one wasted bread back then. It was too precious. If you had bananas or raisins, you could toss those in, but most times it was just bread, milk, and peanut butter working overtime. Families made it in square pans or cast iron skillets, serving it hot with a drizzle of syrup if they were lucky. It wasn't a fancy dessert, but it was one that made you close your eyes with that first bite. Peanut butter bread pudding was poor folks' decadence, a taste of comfort that didn't cost a dime extra. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches were the sweet, sticky, unbelievably satisfying snacks that kids begged for the moment they walked through the door after school. There was something almost magical about how two basic ingredients could turn into a treat that felt both fun and filling. Mothers loved making them because they required no cooking, no cleanup, and almost no money. Just slice a banana, spread the peanut butter thick enough that the bread stuck to your fingers, and press it all together. The moment you took a bite, the peanut butter glued everything together in that slow, chewy way that made kids talk funny until they swallowed. The bananas added just the right amount of sweetness, almost like having dessert disguised as a sandwich. Some kids liked the bread soft, others liked it lightly toasted so the peanut butter melted a little into all the corners. No matter how it was served, it always tasted like the kind of snack that made bad days better and good days even more exciting. It was also the perfect fuel for running outside to play, riding bikes, or disappearing into the backyard until dinner. Mothers loved that it kept kids full without stretching the grocery budget in any painful way. It was cheap, healthy enough for the time, and comforting in a way that never seemed to get old. These sandwiches tasted like childhood freedom, like being able to run barefoot without a care in the world. And that is exactly why kids begged for them, day after day, like it was the best invention anyone had ever come up with. Cheese-topped rice ring turned plain rice into an eye-catching centerpiece that delighted both family members and guests while keeping costs low. Cooked rice was mixed with beaten eggs and lightly seasoned before being pressed into a greased ring mold and baked until firm. After unmolding, the golden rice ring was filled with a medley of creamed vegetables such as peas, carrots, or spinach, then topped with a scattering of melted cheese for a touch of richness. This presentation gave the appearance of a special occasion dish despite relying on everyday pantry staples. Home cooks enjoyed how flexible the recipe was, allowing them to use leftover vegetables or whatever cheese they had available. It provided a balanced meal of grains, vegetables, and dairy while remaining budget-friendly and easy to prepare ahead of time. Cheese-topped rice ring stands as a testament to the imaginative flair of 1960s kitchens, where economical ingredients were transformed into something festive and memorable that could grace both a Sunday dinner table and a neighborhood potluck with equal success. Apple peel jelly was the perfect example of Depression frugality, showing how even scraps could become something sweet. When apples were peeled for pies or other dishes, thrifty homemakers saved the skins rather than discarding them. These peels were boiled with sugar and water, sometimes with a bit of lemon peel until they turned into a flavorful jelly. The jelly could be spread over bread, crackers, or biscuits, instantly brightening the table. It was not as rich as traditional jams, but for families who had little, it felt like a luxury. Children loved the sweet tang, and parents took pride in knowing nothing went to waste. Apple peel jelly was especially popular in rural areas where orchards were common, and every harvest meant piles of peels waiting to be reused. For families struggling through hunger, it was a reminder that comfort could be coaxed from even the most unlikely ingredients. It became both a necessity and a tradition, keeping hope alive through sweetness. Flour dumpling. Water soup was exactly what it sounded like. Boiled water, a pinch of salt, and dumplings made from nothing but flour and whatever fat was left in the house. You mixed the flour with a little water until it clung together in sticky clumps, then dropped spoonfuls into the bubbling pot. The dumplings swelled and softened, turning the water cloudy and thick. Sometimes the dumplings were chewy, sometimes they dissolved. No two pots were ever the same. The flavor came from memory, not ingredients. Some parents told their kids it was their favorite meal as a child, just to make them feel better. Others stayed quiet. There was something hypnotic about watching the lumps rise to the surface, bobbing like pale ghosts in the broth. You ate it fast before it congealed, and if you were lucky, it stuck to your ribs just long enough to fall asleep. This was food that asked for nothing and gave very little in return. But it was warm. It was there. And when you had nothing else, that was enough to earn your respect. Winter ham hock soup was the kind of pot that worked long hours in the background of the home, simmering quietly until every ounce of flavor had been coaxed out of the hock. Once the ham was eaten, that leftover piece still carried enough richness to season an entire pot of vegetables, potatoes, and beans. Grandma let it cook slowly, hours on hours, until the broth glowed golden and fragrant. Sometimes she shredded the small bits of meat that fell loose, but often the flavor alone was enough. This soup was not just a meal. It was a method of stretching what little remained into something comforting and sustaining. Families counted on it during weeks when the budget was tight or the weather kept them indoors. The soup felt honest, humble, and full of the kind of warmth that settled deep. Winter ham hock soup tasted like making the most of everything you had. Water gravy soup was one of those dishes that proved just how creative people had to be when meat and other staples were gone. Made from a simple roux, bacon drippings, flour, and water, this thin broth would be simmered until it took on the consistency of a light gravy. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bacon drippings, which were a precious commodity, added a richness to the broth, making it taste fuller than it had any right to. Water gravy soup wasn't about fancy ingredients. It was about making the most out of what you had. When meat was scarce, this soup became a go-to for many families trying to fill their bellies. It was the ultimate comfort food for tough times, a reminder that even when you didn't have much, you could still create something that made you feel full. The ingenuity behind water gravy soup was a symbol of how resourceful people became when faced with the harshest of circumstances. It wasn't just about food, it was about survival. And sometimes, survival meant finding nourishment in the most unlikely places. Spoonfuls. Dried saltfish was a poor man's meat, cheap, salty, and ready to last through any storm. Before refrigeration, this was how families near the coasts stayed fed all winter. Fishermen would pack the catch in layers of salt until the flesh turned firm and dry, locking in the flavor. Once you had it, all you needed was water and patience to bring it back to life. Rehydrated, fried, or stewed, it carried the taste of the sea and the grit of survival. Poor households found ways to stretch even a small piece into a full pot of chowder or beans. The smell might have been strong, but so was the satisfaction. Salt fish connected entire communities, from the docks of New England to the rural South, where people learned to turn scarcity into tradition. It was proof that with enough salt, skill, and determination, nothing had to go to waste. Mayonnaise and tomato saltines were what passed for luxury when the lights were dim and the pantry looked bare. You'd take a sleeve of saltines, smear each one with a bit of mayonnaise, then press on a slice of tomato fresh from a neighbor's garden or the grocery discount bin, sprinkle a little salt, maybe pepper if you had it, and you were set. Folks called them poor man's canapés, but they tasted like victory after a long day. It was the kind of snack you made barefoot at the kitchen counter with a glass of sweet tea sweating beside you. Kids thought it looked strange, but always came back for another bite because it hit that perfect balance between creamy, salty, and sharp. You could find families across the South and Midwest doing the same thing late at night, catching reruns on television with a paper towel full of saltines in hand. There was no need for fine dining or silver spoons, just a little mayonnaise, a ripe tomato, and something cold to drink. It wasn't just a snack. It was a reminder that the simplest things could feel fancy when you needed them to. Oven-baked potato wedges were the crispy, perfectly seasoned alternative to store-bought fries that kids loved even more. Mothers cut potatoes into thick wedges, tossed them with a little oil and seasoning, and let the oven work its magic. As they baked, the edges crisped while the center stayed soft and tender. Kids hovered near the oven window, waiting for that moment when the wedges turned golden brown. The smell alone promised something delicious. When served, they were hot, salty, and easy to dip in ketchup, making them irresistible. Mothers loved how affordable and healthy they were compared to anything from a diner kids begged for them because they tasted like real fries without the cost. Simple, crunchy, and comforting, these wedges were a quiet weeknight favorite in countless 1960s homes. Chili and crackers were the meal you made when you needed fire in your belly and not much else. Ground beef, a can of beans, tomato sauce, and every spice you could find in the back of the cabinet. You let it simmer until it thickened, bubbling and bold, the kind of dish that fogged up the windows and warmed up the room. You served it with saltine crackers, always saltines, stacked on the side or crumbled right in. Sometimes there was shredded cheese, sometimes a dollop of sour cream. But usually, it was just the basics, and that was fine, because chili did not need help. It had enough heat, enough bite, enough heart. You ate it with a spoon too big for the bowl and left the table feeling like you had won something. Maybe you had. Cornflake-crusted fish squares were a playful answer to the challenge of making inexpensive whitefish appealing to the whole family. Thin fillets of cod or haddock were cut into squares, dipped in milk and egg, and coated with crushed cornflakes left over from breakfast. Baking or frying turned the cereal coating into a crisp, golden crust that sealed in moisture and added a gentle sweetness. This recipe allowed households to use affordable frozen fish while giving it a texture reminiscent of more expensive fried seafood. Children found the crunchy coating irresistible, and parents enjoyed how quickly the dish came together on busy weeknights. The cornflakes acted as an economical substitute for breadcrumbs and made use of pantry items that might otherwise go stale. Served with a squeeze of lemon or a side of tartar sauce, these fish squares brought a fun and frugal twist to the dinner table, showing the inventive spirit of 1960s cooking where nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. Ketchup sandwiches may sound like a joke today, but in the Depression era, they were a quick meal for children and adults alike. With meat out of reach for many, a slice of bread spread thin with ketchup became lunch or even dinner. The tangy, sweet flavor gave the illusion of something more filling, especially when paired with a second slice of bread. Sometimes butter or margarine was added if available, but most of the time it was just bread and ketchup. While humble, it provided calories when little else was around, and children often looked forward to it simply because it tasted different from the usual plain bread. It was also portable, making it an easy option for workers or school lunches. Though it might not sound appetizing now, it kept hunger away for countless families. For many who grew up in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches became an unforgettable part of their childhood survival. Potato peel broth was not made for flavor. It was made for survival. When money was gone and meat was a memory, the scraps took center stage. Families would save every potato skin in a tin on the counter, letting them dry until there were enough to make a pot. Onion ends, carrot tops, maybe even a garlic clove if someone got lucky. Into the water they went. This was broth built from rejection, slowly simmered into something warm, salty, and strangely comforting. A dash of salt made it taste like something you meant to cook. A spoonful of lard, if available, turned it into a meal. It was poured into chipped bowls and eaten with silence. It did not fill you up, but it gave you something warm to hold. Children learned to be grateful for what they did not have, and parents learned to pretend it tasted better than it did. In the quiet after dinner, that pot sat empty on the stove, a small act of defiance against hunger. There was pride in making something from nothing. Pride and just enough strength to do it again tomorrow. Fried hoe cake dumplings were born from the scraps of dough left behind after making bread or cornbread. Nothing was wasted in winter. Grandma pinched off the excess dough and dropped it straight into boiling broth where it puffed and softened. The dumplings soaked up flavor while staying tender inside, becoming small pockets of warmth in every bowl. They stretched a pot of stew into a full meal, turning a few ingredients into enough for everyone at the table. These dumplings were simple, but they carried the ingenuity families needed to make winter feel less harsh. They tasted like resourcefulness, comfort, and home. Canned Vienna sausage stew was the 1980s answer to dinner when the paycheck ran dry, but you still needed to feed everyone. Pop open a can of Vienna sausages, slice them up, and throw them into a pot with instant potatoes and green beans from another can. Let it all simmer in broth until the flavors came together, and you had a meal that felt bigger than it was. The sausages were soft, salty, and oily enough to add richness to the pot. It was a one-dish dinner that didn't need measuring cups or fresh anything. Moms across America called it pantry stew, and it filled houses with that familiar smell of survival and ingenuity. You'd eat it with white bread to soak up the gravy, and for a few minutes, everyone forgot how tight money was. It was a recipe that belonged to those who refused to go hungry, even if all they had was a can and a stove. Turnip top soup was a dish born from the remnants of what the earth gave. During times of extreme rationing, it wasn't just about the food you had, it was about the food you could find. Turnips, a root vegetable that thrived in the toughest conditions, were a staple in many households, and even the tops, the greens, weren't discarded. These turnip greens, sometimes a bit tough and bitter, were boiled with the roots, creating a soup that was as much about making do as it was about getting by. The addition of a bone, if you could find one, might give the broth a little more flavor, but the dish was essentially a minimalist soup, just the earth's bounty and whatever scraps you could gather. The turnip top soup became a symbol of how people learned to value everything, even the parts of a vegetable that others would throw away. It was a simple meal, but one that carried a deeper lesson about resilience and the idea that even when the world was in turmoil, there was still something you could rely on. Flour barrels were the throne of every kitchen, the one thing no home could function without. A big barrel of flour in the corner meant security. It meant bread, dumplings, biscuits, and gravies for days. Poor men guarded their flour like treasure because one scoop could mean breakfast for the family. When you opened the lid and saw a fine white cloud rise, it felt like hope itself. Housewives made biscuits on wooden boards, cutting circles with cups when they had no proper tools. Dumplings floated in broth like little clouds, thickening soups that could stretch another night. Flour was also the base for gravy, that golden miracle that turned scraps into feasts. The smell of hot flour and fat cooking together was as close as you got to luxury on a poor man's plate. It was simple, practical, and pure, proof that even the most basic things can hold a kind of sacred power when times are hard. The barrel stood as a silent promise that tomorrow's meal was already halfway there. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was the sweet ending that made every tight grocery week feel worth it. You'd mix dry milk with cocoa powder, sugar, cornstarch, and a little water, whisking fast until it came together into a glossy brown dream. It simmered slow on the stove, thickening just enough to coat the spoon. Once it cooled, it went into reused butter tubs or chipped mugs, then straight into the icebox until firm. The first spoonful was pure bliss, smooth, sweet, and just chocolatey enough to make you forget how simple it was. Kids licked the pot clean, laughing at the sticky whisk marks on their fingers. Nobody cared that it wasn't real milk. What mattered was that it felt indulgent. Sometimes you'd top it with whipped cream from a can or a sprinkle of sugar if you wanted to be fancy. It was cheap, it was easy, and it made even the hardest weeks taste soft around the edges. Powdered milk chocolate pudding was proof that sweetness didn't come from money. It came from patience, persistence, and love stirred over a warm stove. Frito pie in its cafeteria style was the chaotic, crunchy, messy masterpiece that 1960s kids absolutely adored. It was not fancy or expensive, but it tasted like pure childhood joy. Corn chips formed the base, sometimes poured onto a plate, sometimes eaten straight from the bag. Hot chili or seasoned beef melted the chips just enough, and a shower of cheese glued the whole thing together. Kids loved the mix of textures: crispy edges, soft centers, savory meat, and gooey cheese. It felt fun and a little rebellious, like party food pretending to be dinner. Mothers loved how quick and cheap it was, perfect for busy nights. To kids, it tasted like loud cafeteria lunches, and after-school laughter. Frito pie was pure 1960s magic, unforgettable to anyone who grew up with it. Tuna noodle casserole was the king of kitchen creativity. If you had a can of tuna, a box of noodles, and a single can of soup, you had dinner. This was the casserole that held families together after World War II, the kind of meal that said, "We are broke, but we still eat warm." You dumped the noodles in boiling water, stirred in the tuna, and cracked open that can of cream of mushroom soup like it was the secret to survival. It all went into one big dish, mixed until gray and gloppy, then topped with whatever crunch you could find. Maybe crushed potato chips, maybe stale breadcrumbs. If you were lucky, a little shredded cheese. But that was rare. Tuna noodle casserole was not supposed to taste good. It was supposed to be enough. And it was. It warmed up the house and made it smell like something was baking. That mattered more than you think. Sometimes it fed 6 people on $3. Sometimes you made it again the next day with what was left in the pan. It was frugal, filling, and strangely comforting. And if you grew up poor, it probably sat in front of you more times than you care to admit, steam rising off the top like it was proud to be what it was. Hamburger rice skillet pie demonstrated the 1960s knack for stretching a pound of meat to feed a crowd. Ground beef was cooked with onions, peppers, and a generous helping of cooked rice before being spread in a skillet or shallow casserole. A biscuit dough topping, brushed with milk for shine, transformed the humble filling into a pie that looked more luxurious than its ingredients suggested. By combining inexpensive rice with a small amount of meat, families could create a dish that was both hearty and economical, perfect for busy weeknights. The biscuit layer soaked up the savory juices as it baked, giving each slice a comforting blend of flavors and textures. Many homemakers wrote this recipe on index cards to keep near the stove because it could be made entirely from pantry staples. Children enjoyed the fluffy crust and mild seasoning, while parents appreciated how it filled plates without emptying wallets. This skillet pie remained a dependable favorite for decades because it embodied practicality without sacrificing taste or warmth at the dinner table. Vinegar. Hot water soup was a shock to the tongue, but a relief to the wallet. All it took was boiling water, a splash of vinegar, a touch of garlic if you had it, and a crack of black pepper. Sometimes a bit of stale bread floated in the middle like a soggy raft. The acidity slapped you awake, an almost medicinal burn that reminded you this was not comfort food. This was desperation food. And yet, some folks grew to like it. It was cleansing, they would say. Cleansing like scrubbing the inside of your gut with steel wool. But it was warm, and it filled the bowl. Children cried the first time they tasted it. Adults drank it with quiet eyes. You had to be tired to appreciate something like this. Tired and cold and out of options. It was a reminder that not all poor man's food pretended to be delicious. Some of it just existed to carry you from one hard day to the next. When you swallowed it, you swallowed pride. But you also swallowed proof that you were still here. And sometimes, that was the only thing that mattered. Smothered turnips and tops were the kind of winter dish that proved nothing in the pot ever went to waste, especially during the cold months when every ingredient mattered. Families cooked the roots and the greens together because separating them felt like throwing away flavor no one could afford to lose. Grandma peeled the turnips, chopped them into thick chunks, and washed the greens until the sink filled with steam. She let everything simmer slowly with onions, a little fat if she had it, and enough seasoning to make the whole house smell warm, even when the wind rattled the windows. The roots softened into something mild and comforting, while the greens soaked up every bit of flavor in the pot. This dish tasted like survival shaped into supper, born from hard seasons when people had to stretch what the soil gave them. In many homes, it stood beside cornbread, filling bellies without emptying the pantry. It was simple, it was humble, and yet it carried a depth that only comes from meals made out of necessity and love. Every bite held the kind of wisdom passed down by elders who knew how to turn almost nothing into something that fed everyone at the table. Smothered turnips and tops tasted like winter done right. Butter and sugar sandwiches were the childhood candy of the broke and content. 2 slices of white bread, a spread of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. That was dessert. Kids came home from school hungry, opened the pantry, and made these without asking. Sometimes the butter wasn't real butter, but margarine, slick and sweet just the same. It wasn't fancy, but when you bit into it, the crunch of sugar met the softness of bread in the most perfect way. It was cheap joy in the shape of a sandwich, a moment of sweetness when life was rough around the edges. Parents made them too, not just for kids, but for themselves, because a bite of that sugar and butter sandwich tasted like nostalgia. It reminded them that even when the world felt out of reach, they still had bread, sweetness, and a reason to smile. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor kid's steak. You slapped that bologna in a hot pan until it curled like a rose petal, then threw it on white bread with a smear of mustard. If you were lucky, a slice of cheese made an appearance. If not, the bologna had to carry all the weight. It sizzled, popped, and released that smell. Salty, greasy, unmistakable. There was always that little charred ring around the edge, a perfect halo of survival. This was not deli meat. This was the cheapest pack in the fridge. It came in a big plastic tube, sealed with a twist tie or worse, and you knew it was going to last all week. You did not toast the bread. You barely buttered the pan. The goal was simple. Get it hot and slap it together. Sometimes there was ketchup, sometimes a pickle slice. But most times it was just the basics, a sandwich that told you exactly where you stood. You sat on the floor or leaned over the sink while you ate it, grease dripping down your hand, and never questioned why this was a staple. Because it worked, and because it was yours. Celery and cheese soufflé brought elegance to an inexpensive vegetable that most people considered only a snack or soup ingredient. Finely chopped celery was sautéed with a bit of butter and folded into a fluffy base of beaten eggs and grated cheese before being baked until the top rose and browned. Despite its sophisticated appearance, the ingredients were simple and affordable, making it a popular choice for dinner parties on a budget. The soufflé delivered a gentle crunch from the celery against the airy texture of the eggs, surprising guests who expected something plain. Because the recipe relied on pantry staples like milk, eggs, and a small amount of cheese, it fit perfectly into the frugal cooking philosophy of the time. Home cooks loved that it felt fancy without requiring costly ingredients or specialized equipment. Served with a crisp salad or a slice of toasted bread, this dish turned an ordinary evening into a special occasion and demonstrated how a humble vegetable could take center stage in a memorable meal. Rolled oat meatloaf was another way people made do when meat was a rare luxury during the Depression era. The idea was simple. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to find, so they became the backbone of many loaves when ground beef was scarce. Housewives would combine rolled oats with onion, a little broth or tomato juice, and perhaps an egg if one could be spared, then bake it until firm. The oats took on the flavor of the few seasonings and drippings that were used, giving the illusion of meat even if very little was present. If there was any beef or pork to add, it stretched further thanks to the bulk of the oats. Served with gravy made from pan drippings or even a thin tomato sauce, it could feel hearty enough to pass for the real thing. Many families came to appreciate the flavor and comfort it provided, even without meat. Old Bean Water Revival was the second act for yesterday's pot of beans. After draining the cooked beans, the leftover liquid, thick, cloudy, and starchy, was saved instead of tossed. Into a new pot it went, sometimes with a handful of cornmeal, stale bread, or whatever wilted greens were on their last day. It was not quite soup, not quite stew, more of a porridge that refused to pick a side. You stirred it slowly so it would not stick. You added salt with a heavy hand and hoped the memory of last night's beans was still strong enough to flavor it. The smell was faintly sour. The texture was oddly satisfying. No two bowls were the same. And because it came from leftovers, you ate it quietly, as if the meal knew it was not supposed to exist. It was an echo of a meal, stretched past its expiration date, made to feed one more mouth. Some families even preferred it to the original beans. Others called it shame soup. But when the cupboards were empty and the paycheck was still a week away, this gray broth with its mystery lumps kept people going. It was a second chance in a bowl. Boiled hamburger gravy on bread was a working-class miracle that filled bellies and stretched a single pound of beef for days. Instead of frying the meat, folks would boil it in water until it crumbled into soft bits, then stir in flour and a little grease to make a thick, savory gravy. It wasn't pretty, but it smelled like home, and it soaked right through white bread like a promise. Some called it poor man's stew, others called it Tuesday dinner, but it was the same everywhere, simple, hearty, and cheap. It was the kind of meal you made when the fridge looked bare, yet somehow everyone left the table satisfied. The gravy clung to your fingers, the bread got soggy, and no one complained because it tasted like comfort. If you were lucky, you added pepper or onions, but even plain, it hit the spot. This was survival cooking that didn't apologize for itself, just warm, heavy food for long days and tired hearts. Hot dog boats with melted cheese were the kind of fun, silly, absolutely irresistible meal that made every child feel like dinner had suddenly become a party. Mothers made them by slicing hot dogs down the center, filling the opening with a strip of cheese and popping them under the broiler until everything bubbled and browned. The hot dogs curled just enough to cradle the cheese, creating that little boat shape that kids thought was hilarious. The smell hit fast, a mix of smoky hot dog and melting cheese that could pull a kid from any room in the house. Mothers loved them because they were cheap, easy, and guaranteed to make even the pickiest eater happy. Kids loved them because they felt playful, almost like something from a carnival. The cheese would stretch when you took a bite, and sometimes it would drip down the side in a way that made dinner feel like an adventure. Served with a little ketchup or mustard, these boats were a masterpiece of budget cooking that tasted far richer than they really were. Kids begged for them constantly because they made dinner fun, filling, and unforgettable. They were one of those meals that captured exactly what it felt like to grow up in the 1960s. Simple joys, simple ingredients, and memories that last a lifetime. Sloppy Joes were chaos in a bun. They were sweet, tangy, sticky, and somehow always managed to spill no matter how carefully you ate them. This was not just a school lunch special. It was dinner for anyone trying to make a pound of ground beef stretch to its limits. The sauce was ketchup, sugar, vinegar, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire if your family had that kind of spice rack. You browned the meat, dumped in the sauce, stirred it until it bubbled, then plopped it on the cheapest hamburger buns you could find. The kind that disintegrated under pressure. If you were feeling fancy, maybe you toasted the buns. If you were feeling realistic, you just got paper towels ready. Sloppy Joes made no effort to be elegant. They were messy, loud, and comforting. The kind of meal that made a mess of your face and your plate, but you ate every bite because it tasted like sugar and salt and home. You ate fast because it would soak through the bread if you waited, and you never complained because this was one of the good ones, one of the rare meals that actually felt like a treat. Rice croquettes were a depression trick for turning yesterday's leftovers into something new and appetizing. When rice was cooked in large batches, families often had more than they could finish, and waste was simply not an option. Leftover rice was mashed together with a bit of flour or egg when available, then shaped into small balls and fried in a skillet with fat or drippings. The result was a golden, crispy outside and a soft, chewy inside that children especially loved. Adults appreciated how croquettes added texture and flavor to meals that were otherwise bland. They could be served with gravy, broth, or just eaten plain, offering flexibility depending on what was on hand. In some households, croquettes became the centerpiece of dinner when no meat was available. They proved that resourcefulness in the kitchen could transform scraps into something enjoyable. Families remembered rice croquettes not just as a thrifty dish, but as a rare moment when leftovers felt special instead of repetitive. They were simple, but in hard times, simplicity was often the best comfort of all. Canned Vienna sausages were the snack that somehow became dinner more often than anyone wanted to admit. You pulled back the metal lid, revealing 6 or 7 tiny pink sausages floating in mystery liquid. They smelled like salt and metal and something vaguely meaty. You ate them cold, straight from the can, or warmed them in a pot if you had time. Sometimes you served them with crackers, sometimes just with your fingers. No one dreamed of Vienna sausages, but we learned to respect them. They were there when fresh food was not. They tasted like hard times, but also like resilience. They were soft, almost mushy, but full of protein and easy to store. In homes where refrigeration was unreliable and money was always short, these cans were gold. Not because they tasted good, but because they lasted. They were cheap, reliable, always there when you needed something, anything to put on a plate. You never bragged about eating Vienna sausages, but you remembered them, because they saw you through more hard days than you can count. Hamburger stew was the cozy, simmering bowl that brought families together on chilly evenings. Mothers browned a bit of ground meat, then added potatoes, canned vegetables, and broth until everything blended into a rich, hearty mixture. It filled the kitchen with a deep, comforting smell that lingered for hours. Kids loved dipping bread into the broth, soaking every last bit. The stew was simple but full of flavor, warming from the inside out. Mothers made it because it stretched ingredients and fed everyone without effort. Kids begged for it because it felt like real homemade food, the kind that made the whole evening slower and softer. Hamburger stew was pure comfort in a bowl, made from almost nothing but tasting like everything a family needed. Ritz Cracker chicken coating turned every oven into a poor man's fryer and every Sunday night into a feast worth waiting for. You'd crush up a full sleeve of buttery Ritz crackers inside a plastic bag until they were fine and crumbly, then roll chicken legs, thighs, or even drumsticks through a bowl of beaten eggs before covering them completely in the crumbs. Once they hit the oven, the smell alone could fill the house with the promise of something good. The crackers browned just right, trapping all the juices inside the chicken and creating a golden crust that was crisp, savory, and rich without needing oil or a deep fryer. It was crunchy on the outside, tender in the middle, and budget-friendly all the way through. Families loved it because it felt like fried chicken night without the cleanup or cost. Even neighbors could smell it through the windows and knew someone was eating well. It was the kind of dish you could bring to a church supper and proudly pass off as something special. Ritz Cracker chicken coating wasn't just about saving money, it was about finding flavor where others saw leftovers. It was thrift at its finest, and nobody complained about seconds. Hominy and lye water broth was a traditional dish that required the skill and knowledge to make hominy from scratch, a process that involved soaking dried corn in lye water to remove the husks and turn it into a more digestible form. Once the hominy was prepared, it was boiled in water to create a basic broth. The result was a hearty, earthy dish that could fill you up with little more than corn and water. The lye-treated corn had a slightly different texture and flavor, making the broth both filling and comforting, even if it wasn't particularly flavorful. For families with limited resources, hominy and lye water broth was a dish that could be eaten often because it didn't require much. Hominy, once a staple of indigenous diets, became a symbol of resilience during times of hardship, an old dish made new again for survival. For those who ate it, hominy and lye water broth was a reminder that sometimes the simplest foods were the ones that got you through. Canned pineapple sandwiches were the kind of sweet and savory mystery that only the 1980s could have invented. You'd take 2 slices of plain white bread, spread mayonnaise on both sides, and add a shiny yellow ring of canned pineapple straight from the tin. Sometimes people added a sprinkle of salt or a dash of chili powder, but most kept it simple: soft bread, creamy mayo, and the sharp sweetness of fruit. The pineapple juice would soak through the bread just enough to make it sticky and tender. It was a strange combination that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow it did. Families who couldn't afford lunch meat still had a way to make something that tasted like effort. The contrast of tangy and smooth, salty and sugary made it oddly addictive. Kids might roll their eyes at first, but one bite usually turned into two. It was the kind of meal made when paychecks came late and grocery lists ran short, and yet it still managed to feel cheerful. Canned pineapple sandwiches became a quirky comfort across small towns and big cities alike, reminding everyone that even strange pairings can taste like hope. Pancakes for dinner were the delightful surprise that made kids cheer the moment they realized breakfast had taken over the evening. Mothers turned flour, eggs, and milk into a warm, fluffy stack that felt like an escape from routine. The smell of batter hitting a hot pan filled the house in seconds. Kids loved flipping the pancakes if they were allowed to, watching the bubbles form before the perfect golden underside appeared. Butter melted instantly over the warm stack, and syrup turned the plate into something dreamy. It was cheap, filling, and fun. Everything a kid could want. Mothers liked it because it required little planning and stretched ingredients well. Kids begged for it because it felt rebellious and comforting at the same time. Pancakes for dinner were the kind of magic that only happened once in a while, making it unforgettable every time. Buttermilk potato pancakes were a beloved solution for leftover mashed potatoes and a shining example of kitchen thrift in mid-century America. Cold mashed potatoes were combined with tangy buttermilk, a beaten egg, and a bit of flour to create a batter that fried up into golden cakes with crisp edges and fluffy centers. Served hot from the griddle, these pancakes paired beautifully with applesauce, sour cream, or a simple sprinkle of salt and pepper. The recipe offered a new life to yesterday's potatoes, ensuring that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Families welcomed the comforting aroma that filled the house as the pancakes cooked, making even an ordinary weeknight feel special. They were hearty enough to stand alone as supper, but also worked well alongside a small slice of ham or a bowl of vegetable soup. Easy to make and quick to cook, these pancakes became a regular part of many 1960s dinner rotations and remain a reminder that frugality can be delicious when handled with care and creativity. Pancakes for dinner was the rebellion no one talked about, but everyone loved. You mixed flour, milk, and eggs in a bowl, poured it onto a hot griddle, and watched the bubbles rise like tiny promises. Stack after stack, golden and imperfect, sometimes burnt at the edges. It felt like cheating, but no one called it out. In a house full of stress and unpaid bills, it was the rare moment that felt light. Pancakes reminded us we could bend the rules without breaking ourselves. You poured syrup until it pooled at the base, or you used jam, honey, or even just sugar and butter. Whatever you had, dinner did not have to be savory. It did not have to follow the rules. Pancakes were a reminder that even when money was tight, you could still enjoy something. You could still treat yourself. Kids loved it. Adults sighed with relief. No meat, no sides, just breakfast masquerading as dinner. And maybe that is what made it so special. It felt like breaking the rules in the best possible way. Milk toast was one of the humblest but most beloved comfort foods of the Depression. Families would toast slices of bread, often stale or homemade, and soak them in warm milk flavored with sugar or a pinch of salt. The softened bread took on a custard-like texture that children especially enjoyed, while adults valued its warmth and simplicity. Milk toast was often served for breakfast or supper when cupboards were bare, providing a soothing, filling option that used ingredients most homes had on hand. It was easy to digest, which also made it a common food for the elderly and the sick. In households where milk was scarce, families watered it down, making it stretch further while still preserving the spirit of the dish. Milk toast was never glamorous, but it carried the weight of familiarity and comfort, reminding people that even the plainest foods could feel nurturing. It is remembered today not for extravagance, but for the quiet reassurance it gave in the hardest times. Wilted lettuce and hot grease broth was an invention born of necessity and hunger. Imagine a time when fresh produce was scarce, and what you had on hand was wilting in the heat of summer. The solution was simple: bacon grease poured over those tired greens, transforming them into something that barely resembled soup but could fill an empty stomach. The bitter leaves softened in the hot grease, which added a layer of richness and flavor that made it somehow bearable. You could stretch this meager concoction with just a bit of seasoning, and suddenly, it became more than just a sad vegetable dish. It was a meal. For those who lived through it, the memory of that greasy, wilted broth could bring a sense of bitter nostalgia, a reminder of the lengths they went to survive. It was about making do with what you had, no matter how unappealing it might seem. Looking back, the ingenuity that birthed this dish speaks volumes about the resilience of those who lived through it, how survival was often tied to finding beauty in the simplest, most humble things. Velveeta potato bake was the crown jewel of the comfort table in the 1980s, and it didn't take much to make. Just a few peeled and diced potatoes, a splash of milk, and a handful of bright orange Velveeta cubes that melted into creamy gold. The whole dish bubbled and hissed in the oven, turning every corner of the house into a buttery, cheesy paradise. When you opened the oven door, the smell hit first. Rich, warm, and unmistakably fake, but somehow perfect. The top browned slightly while the middle stayed soft and gooey, thick enough to scoop but smooth enough to melt on your tongue. Families brought it to church potlucks and Sunday lunches, always disappearing before anything else on the table. It was the definition of cheap cooking done right, the kind of dish that cost a few dollars but felt like a treat. Kids thought it was fancy, parents knew it was survival. Velveeta potato bake didn't pretend to be healthy or refined. It was comfort in its purest form. It was a casserole made with love and necessity, proof that a block of cheese could turn poverty into pride. Creamed corn over toast was the sweet, unexpectedly beloved meal that kids liked far more than they ever admitted. Mothers made it because canned corn was cheap, and a quick stovetop simmer with milk or butter created a creamy, comforting topping. Poured over warm toast, it soaked in just enough to soften the bread without making it soggy. Kids loved the sweetness, the warmth, and the way each bite felt like a kinder, gentler version of dinner. It was simple, soft, and soothing, perfect for days when appetites were unpredictable. Mothers appreciated that it required almost no ingredients and filled hungry stomachs quickly. Kids begged for it because it felt familiar and safe, like a meal meant just for them. Creamed corn over toast was one of those small, surprising favorites that only grew more nostalgic with time. Ramen noodles were the dinner of desperation that somehow became a ritual. A block of dried noodles, a packet of salt and spice, and 3 minutes in boiling water. That was it. That was the whole recipe. And yet, it kept showing up in pantries, college dorms, first apartments, and homes where money ran out before the month did. You could dress it up, sure, but no one was fooled. It was hunger food, dressed in hot broth and convenience. And somehow that truth only made it more familiar. You slurped it straight from the bowl, steam burning your face, the broth clinging to your lips. Sometimes you added an egg, sometimes hot sauce, but most times, you just made do. The noodles were limp, the broth was salty enough to sting, but it was food, and food meant one more night survived. You did not eat it because you wanted to. You ate it because it was all you could afford, and you learned to love it anyway. Beet and potato hash celebrated color and economy in equal measure, offering a hearty skillet meal from two of the most affordable vegetables around. Diced beets and potatoes were pan-fried with onions and a bit of oil, or leftover drippings until the edges turned golden and crisp. The beets added a deep ruby hue that stained the potatoes with a cheerful pink, making the dish as attractive as it was filling. A sprinkle of vinegar or a dollop of sour cream brought brightness to each bite, proving that frugal cooking could still deliver vibrant flavor. This hash was often served as a meatless main course or topped with a poached egg for extra protein, making it ideal for households watching their grocery spending. Gardeners loved it because it used ingredients that stored well through winter, ensuring a dependable dinner even when fresh produce was scarce. Beet and potato hash remains a classic example of how mid-century cooks turned basic staples into something comforting, flavorful, and visually striking without spending more than a few coins. Breaded tomato slices were a Depression-era favorite when green or underripe tomatoes were all that gardens could spare. Rather than waste them, families would slice the tomatoes thick, dip them in a little cornmeal or flour, and fry them until golden. The result was crisp on the outside, tangy inside, and surprisingly satisfying. Sometimes salt or pepper was added, but often they were served plain, still managing to feel like a treat in households where luxuries were rare. This dish became especially popular in rural areas where families grew their own produce and needed creative ways to use every part of the harvest. Children enjoyed the crunch, and adults valued how it stretched a small supply of vegetables into something filling. Breaded tomato slices became both a side dish and sometimes even a main meal, depending on how scarce other foods were. They reflected both thrift and resourcefulness, proving that even unripe produce could be transformed into comfort food. Egg drop water soup was perhaps one of the most basic yet comforting dishes to come from the era. When food was so scarce, even something as simple as an egg became a precious commodity. In a time when the shelves were often bare and protein was hard to come by, the egg drop water soup provided a moment of nourishment and a bit of warmth. The process was almost magical. Boiling water seasoned with whatever spices or herbs you had on hand, then cracking an egg into it. The egg would swirl in the boiling water, creating soft, silky threads that offered a small amount of protein and comfort. It was simple, but it was enough to calm the hunger, even if just for a moment. In those days, simplicity wasn't a choice, it was all there was. And yet, something about that humble egg floating in a hot broth still carried with it a sense of comfort. It was a reminder that even in the most desperate of times, you could still find solace in something as basic as an egg. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Canned ravioli was the Italian dinner that came in a can and never asked for praise. You popped open the metal lid, poured the heavy red sauce into a pot or a bowl, and microwaved it until it bubbled around the edges. The smell was artificial, the sauce too sweet, and the ravioli too soft, but none of that mattered, because it was food. And sometimes that was the only requirement. Chef Boyardee was not a chef in your kitchen, he was a lifeline. A shortcut to something that felt like a meal, even if it came from a shelf instead of a stove. You ate it straight from the bowl, sometimes with a slice of bread to soak up the sauce. Other times, just a fork and a quick prayer that no one noticed how many nights in a row you were eating the same thing. The meat inside the pasta was more memory than substance, a whisper of protein in a sea of tomato. But it was hot, and it was filling, and it kept the stomach quiet when the cupboards were mostly bare. You were not proud of it, but you were grateful, because for $1 or less, it gave you something to hold on to. Dandelion weed soup was a bitter yet filling dish that many learned to make from the weeds growing in their yards. Dandelions, often seen as nothing more than a nuisance, became a valuable food source during tough times. The greens, when boiled, created a soup that was both nutritious and, for some, a bit of an acquired taste. The bitterness of the dandelion leaves wasn't for everyone, but when food was scarce, even the most bitter herbs became something worth harvesting. Foraging became a way of life, and dandelion weed soup was just one example of how people adapted to the food shortages they faced. The idea that something as common as a weed could feed a family was a powerful lesson in resilience. For those who lived through it, it was a reminder that survival didn't always come from the food you wanted. It came from the food you could find. Fried potatoes and onions were the poor man's hash, a skillet full of sizzling honesty. You sliced the potatoes thin, tossed them in a pan with oil or bacon grease, and added onions until the whole house smelled like something was finally cooking. It was loud, smoky, and always worth the wait. The edges got crispy, the centers stayed soft, and the onions caramelized just enough to make you forget there was no meat. There was no recipe, just instinct and repetition, the kind passed down by watching, not reading. One pan, one burner, and the hope that there was enough to go around. You flipped it with whatever spatula had not melted yet, served it right out of the pan, and ate it fast before the crisp turned to mush. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever you needed it to be. You could dress it up with ketchup or cheese or just eat it plain. No one judged. It was filling, cheap, and tasted better than most things you could afford. In the right moment, it tasted like comfort. In the wrong one, it tasted like the only option. But either way, it got the job done.
Caraway cabbage stew showcased the old-world flavors that many American families rediscovered in the 1960s while keeping costs firmly under control. Shredded cabbage simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, and a sprinkling of aromatic caraway seeds until the vegetables softened and the broth turned fragrant. The caraway lent a gentle licorice note that lifted the humble ingredients, creating a stew that was both comforting and unexpectedly complex. A small amount of butter or oil added richness without driving up the price, and the dish required only a handful of pantry staples to feed a crowd. Many families with Central or Eastern European heritage embraced this recipe as a taste of tradition, while others simply enjoyed its hearty simplicity. Served with rye bread or a slice of cornbread, caraway cabbage stew delivered warmth and satisfaction during cold months. It remains a reminder of how immigrant flavors blended seamlessly into American home cooking, offering deep taste and nourishment from ingredients that were inexpensive, widely available, and easy to store through the winter.
Pickled watermelon rinds turned what many would throw away into a sweet, sour preserve that families treasured during the Depression. When fresh fruit was too precious to waste, thrifty homemakers saved the tough white rind of watermelons. These rinds were boiled with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they softened and took on a tangy sweetness. Stored in jars, they became both a condiment and a dessert, brightening up otherwise bland meals. Children loved them for their unexpected flavor, and adults valued how nothing went to waste. Victory gardens often produced watermelons, and in households where money was scarce, even the rinds had value. Pickled watermelon rinds were served alongside beans, bread, or meats when they could be found, making ordinary meals feel more lively. Many families kept recipes for these preserves, passing them down as reminders of how every scrap could be used. The dish was both resourceful and flavorful, embodying the resilience that defined Depression-era cooking. Barley and bone soup was a hearty dish that embodied the art of stretching the little you had into something that could feed the whole family. Barley, a grain that was cheap and easy to store, was often used as a filler, while bones, often stripped of any remaining meat, provided the base for a broth. The bones were simmered for hours, extracting what little marrow was left, and the barley absorbed the richness of the broth, turning it into something filling. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. The soup was an example of how, during hard times, the food you had wasn't just a meal. It was a story of survival, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It wasn't about how much you had. It was about how you made the most of what you could get. Barley and bone soup became a staple in many households, a reminder that sometimes the most nourishing meals were the simplest ones, built on the foundation of what others would have called scraps. Fried potato peel chips proved that nothing went to waste in the thrifty kitchen. When you peeled potatoes for dinner, you saved every strip, rinsed them, and threw them into a hot pan of oil until they curled and browned. Sprinkle salt, and suddenly you had the crispest, saltiest snack imaginable. It was crunchy, earthy, and satisfying in a way that store-bought chips could never match. Poor families knew better than to toss good food away, and this snack was living proof. Kids would snatch them from paper towels while they were still warm, mouths burning, but too happy to care. It was the kind of food that made the kitchen smell rich even when you had nothing fancy to cook. Fried potato peel chips were a masterclass in making something from scraps, turning the parts others threw away into a reason to smile. Hot dogs and pork and beans were the kind of meal that felt special even though everything came from a can or a simple package. Mothers liked it because it was easy, and kids loved that sweet and salty mix that felt like comfort in a bowl. She sliced the hot dogs, let them sizzle in a skillet, then poured the thick beans over the top so everything could bubble together. The smell alone made kids hover around the stove waiting for their plates. It was cheap, filling, and needed nothing but a fork or a piece of toast to feel complete. Some families added onions, others kept it plain, but every family agreed it tasted like the best kind of simplicity. It reminded kids of slow evenings, a little extra fun, and moments when something ordinary felt exciting. Hot dogs and pork and beans were joyful, easy, and exactly what childhood dinners were supposed to feel like. Cream-chipped beef on toast was the kind of meal that did not ask for approval. It just showed up. Soldiers had it in mess halls, factory workers had it on break. And if you grew up poor, you probably stared at that milky white sauce clinging to thin strips of salty beef, wondering why it always tasted like desperation with a pinch of comfort. The dish was nicknamed SOS, and no, that did not stand for Save Our Souls, though maybe it should have. It was stuff on a shingle, if you want the cleaned-up version. A slice of toast, barely toasted, because who was wasting electricity on that? Then came the sauce, a flour-thickened mix of butter, milk, and cheap dried beef. Sometimes not even real beef, just salty mystery meat that tried its best. It hit the plate with a wet slap, and you ate it not because you wanted to, but because it was there. Because there was nothing else. It was World War leftovers cooked for peacetime kitchens, and it filled you up, whether you liked it or not. Today, it lives mostly in memory and old military cookbooks. But for those who ate it every week, it is not something you forget. You never really forget what it feels like to scrape the last bit of sauce off your plate with a slice of bread you wish was thicker. Green bean croquettes brought new life to leftover vegetables, turning them into crispy patties that satisfied even the pickiest eaters. Cooked green beans were mashed with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and a sprinkle of herbs, then shaped into small rounds and pan-fried until golden on the outside and soft within. This dish allowed thrifty homemakers to stretch a handful of beans into a full meal, pairing perfectly with a dollop of ketchup or a simple white sauce. Children loved the crunch, and parents appreciated the low cost and quick preparation time. Green bean croquettes also demonstrated the growing influence of European cooking techniques in American kitchens, where frying and breadcrumb coatings were becoming increasingly popular. Served alongside a salad or a scoop of mashed potatoes, they brought variety and texture to the dinner table without adding strain to the grocery budget. Their lasting charm lies in the way they prove that even the simplest leftovers can be turned into something special when treated with care and creativity. Dandelion coffee was one of the many substitutes that appeared when coffee beans were either unavailable or unaffordable. Families would dig up dandelion roots, roast them carefully until dark, and grind them into a coarse powder. When brewed, the result resembled coffee in both color and aroma, though the flavor carried a bitter earthiness all its own. For those accustomed to real coffee, it was not quite the same, but it became a daily ritual that provided both warmth and comfort in lean times. Children and adults alike drank it, often with a little sugar or milk if available to soften the bitterness. Because dandelions were free and abundant, the drink spread widely in both rural and urban areas. It symbolized the Depression's spirit of using whatever nature offered, even weeds, to replace expensive imports. For many families, dandelion coffee was not just a beverage, but a reminder that comfort could still be found in the simplest, most overlooked places. Corn cob broth was another dish born from the practice of using every part of a food item. After the kernels were scraped off the corn cob, the cobs themselves were boiled in water with onions and bay leaves. The broth that resulted was surprisingly sweet and savory, a flavor that came from the remnants of the corn. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a simple soup that could stretch the meal a little longer. The corn cobs were a part of the food that would have otherwise been discarded, but during times of scarcity, even the most overlooked items were turned into something valuable. Corn cob broth was a reminder that when things seemed impossible, there was always something to be made from what you had. It wasn't about the amount of food. It was about finding the hidden potential in what others would toss aside. For those who lived through it, it was a testament to the ingenuity that came out of necessity, a lesson in how to survive when there didn't seem to be much to work with. Fried bologna sandwiches were the crown jewel of cheap meals that somehow tasted like pure magic to a 1960s kid. You would hear that sizzle hit the pan and instantly know something good was coming. Mothers did not need fancy cuts of meat to keep kids happy, just a thin slice of bologna and a hot skillet. The edges curled as it cooked, forming that little bowl shape every kid waited for. Some wanted it soft, others begged for it crisp, but everyone agreed it tasted perfect. Then came the soft white bread, the kind that practically melted when you bit into it. Maybe you added mustard, maybe not. But the flavor never needed help. It was salty, warm, and comforting in a way that felt bigger than the ingredients. Mothers loved it because it took almost no time, and kids loved it because it never once felt cheap. Fried bologna sandwiches were childhood on a plate, simple and perfect every single time. Goulash was not Hungarian, not the kind we grew up with. This was American goulash, elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a tomato sauce that always tasted a little like metal. It was a one-pot meal, no rules, just a way to take cheap ingredients and turn them into something that could feed a small army. Some families used onions, others added garlic if they had it. But at its core, it was just meat, pasta, and sauce. And it was enough. You could scoop it out in huge portions and still have leftovers. It reheated well. It was easy to make. And most importantly, it was cheap. Goulash was the dinner you made when you could not afford variety. It was everything in one dish. And it worked. You knew it was going to be a goulash night when the cupboards were getting low and the mood in the house was just a little more tired, but somehow that big pot of steaming pasta made things feel okay. For one night at least. Apple sausage bread. Pudding married sweet and savory flavors in a way that perfectly captured the experimental spirit of the 1960s kitchen. Day-old bread cubes soaked up a custard of milk and eggs before being mixed with diced apples and small bits of sausage for richness. The dish baked until the top turned golden and the apples released their gentle perfume, filling the home with an inviting scent. By using stale bread and modest amounts of meat, thrifty cooks created a dinner that felt both indulgent and practical. The sweetness of the fruit balanced the smoky sausage, while the custard kept every bite moist. Families often served it with a simple green salad for contrast or a drizzle of maple syrup when they wanted extra sweetness. This recipe highlighted the era's willingness to blend unexpected flavors while keeping costs low. Leftovers reheated beautifully for breakfast the next day, making it a true two-meal wonder that reflected the frugal yet inventive cooking style of mid-century American households. Cabbage roll. Casserole was one of those Depression-era meals that made the most of scraps while still delivering real comfort to the table. Instead of carefully rolling leaves around bits of rice or meat, families would simply layer chopped cabbage with leftover grains, stale bread, and whatever scraps of vegetables they had. Sometimes there was even a small amount of ground pork or beef mixed in, though most of the time the casserole relied on stretching every flavor from the scraps themselves. A little vinegar or tomato juice added tang and moisture, while onions gave it a base of flavor. Once it baked, the entire dish came together into something hearty enough to serve a large family for very little money. The casserole was a dish that spoke to both ingenuity and the realities of the time, because not everyone could spare hours or meat for proper cabbage rolls. Layering scraps turned survival cooking into something close to celebration. Boiled pumpkin and onion soup was a staple during the fall, particularly in rural households where both ingredients were easy to grow and abundant. The pumpkin, a humble yet nourishing vegetable, was boiled down until soft, then mixed with onions to give it a savory depth. The sweetness of the pumpkin was balanced by the sharpness of the onions, creating a hearty and surprisingly complex soup. To make it even more comforting, a dash of pepper and vinegar were added, those simple spices providing a warmth that filled not just the belly but the soul. It wasn't an expensive dish, but it carried a deep connection to the land and the seasons, reminding families of the hard work and harvests that made it possible to eat through the winter. For many, this soup represented the connection between the land, the seasons, and survival. It wasn't just food, it was the warmth of the fall, the harvest, and the promise of getting through the cold months. While the recipe might seem quaint now, back then, it was a constant reminder of the cycle of life and the ways in which a simple meal could carry so much meaning. Cheese toast under the broiler was the quick, melty after-school snack that could turn even the longest day around. Mothers made it because it took only a slice of bread, a sprinkle of cheese, and a few minutes under the broiler. As soon as the cheese bubbled and browned, the whole house smelled warm and comforting. Kids rushed to the kitchen the moment they heard that little sizzle. The edges of the bread crisped up while the center stayed soft, and the cheese melted into a perfect golden layer that stretched when they pulled it apart. It was simple, cheap, and endlessly satisfying. Mothers appreciated that it filled hungry kids fast without requiring a full meal. Kids begged for it because it felt indulgent, even though it was made from the most basic ingredients. Cheese toast was the kind of small pleasure that defined 1960s afternoons, warm and familiar in all the right ways. Which cheap dinner from your grandparents' kitchen do you still remember? Drop your favorite memory in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more forgotten flavors from the past.